Welcome back to Untaming Masculinity, the podcast where we tackle issues relevant to men and their journeys to reclaim their masculinity. I'm Dan, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and good friend, Brad. What's going on, man?
Not much, man. Just another day in paradise. I was telling you this on Friday, but I've been training jiu-jitsu for about a year, and whenever I go, I usually will go to classes in the morning that don't have a jiu-jitsu professor there. They're usually no-gi classes, so I'd never really advanced. I've been training for a year, and I'd obviously gotten better, but I was still a no-stripe white belt. And then I got a text saying, "Hey, Brad, Johnny wants to talk to you." Johnny's the owner of the gym. He's the guy who handles all the promotions and everything. So I went and saw Johnny, and he gave me a couple stripes. So I feel like I'm making some progress, and I don't suck as bad in life. But yeah. That's been my week. That happened. I did a bunch of reseeding and fertilizing yesterday. Spent some time at IKEA today, buying my son a backup panda because he's 4, and 4-year-olds need backup stuffed animals in case they lose one. But anyways, how are you, man?
Sorry, I'm just laughing because at first it sounded really cool because you were talking about progressing in jiu-jitsu, and then you just sounded like Frank the Tank from Old School with IKEA and Home Depot and maybe a little Bed Bath and Beyond if you have time.
That's the nuance of life, man. That's manhood right there.
It is. That is definitely married life right there. I hear you. So I'm doing pretty good. It's been a quiet week. I got some mountain biking in last weekend, which thoroughly enjoyed, and I don't know. We're just slowly creeping into spring here in the Northeast. The weather wants to hold on to the cold, but at the same time, we're seeing signs, so it's good. Definitely getting outside more, enjoying life a little bit.
Good.
So before the show, you and I were talking a little bit, and you had an idea for a topic to discuss tonight, something that had come up or something you had read. So you want to kick us off here?
Yeah, absolutely. So this morning when I was at the gym, I was listening to the Jocko Underground podcast that was dropped today. And the concept or the premise of this conversation was that we don't need to have an opinion about every freaking thing. Case in point, all of us know a guy, some of us are that guy, where regardless of the topic, sports, fitness, finances, the stock market, real estate, technology, reading, philosophy, all this stuff, we have an opinion on it. And no matter what the topic is, you bring it up, you say your piece about it, you get that out there. And the second that I started listening to that podcast, it really hit home because I've been that guy. I've been the opinionated. I've got my 2 cents to say about literally every damn topic out there. And it reminds me of, I'm going to say this, and if he listens to this, I apologize in advance. I've got a brother-in-law. He's a really good dude. He's a really good guy. He's very intelligent. He's successful. He also has an opinion about literally everything. So every time we get together for family functions, he's talking about everything. And I mean literally everything. Sprinkler systems, aerating, salt, like literally everything the guy has an opinion about. And I was sitting there one day and I realized, you know what? He's a good guy. I don't like talking to him because he has opinions about literally everything. And I expressed this to my wife, and my wife looked at me dead ass serious and said, "Brad, you're the same way." And it was very eye-opening to me because I realized I was very much an opinionated person about everything. And to an extent, I still am. And the way that I want to kick this conversation off, and when I'm kicking it over to you, is Ryan Holiday has his website, The Daily Stoic, dailystoic.com. And he sends out newsletters. And obviously, he's got his books and all of that. But he said this about having an opinion about everything. He said, the Stoics saw opinion as the source of most misery. It's what takes objective situations and makes them good, bad, wrong, unfair, essential, deserved, or outrageous. It's also what takes things that have nothing to do with us and makes them problems for us. Not liking what some other person is doing, not believing something outside of our control should be done the way that it is being done, and on and on. In fact, if you were to think of the worst punishment you could inflict on a person, it would be to cast a spell on them that says, you will now have a strong opinion on everything you see and hear. Why? Because inevitably, They find that much of what happens to them is disagreeable to that opinion, and worse, they'll find themselves in many pointless disagreements with other people about those opinions. So I'm just going to throw it over you, Dan. Having read that, what does that message say to you?
It speaks to exactly what you were talking about. The fact that we very much live in a world where everyone has to have an opinion. I mean, social media is a major factor into all of this, in the sense of that's what it is. It's for a place for you to post opinions, and it's where people argue over it. I mean, what is the cesspool of Twitter other than people disagreeing on their opinions? And that's almost that spell that they talk about there is giving people that mandate. But to your point, or to the point of the quote rather, that is such a disastrous thing to have. And I'm going to start that all by saying I fall into the same trap as you. Every time I see something on TV or hear something on the news or whatever, I feel like I need to have an opinion on it. I literally cannot remember the last time I watched something and just went, oh, that's interesting, and didn't put my viewpoint on it, be it political, or otherwise. It's an annoyance. It really is. Like, what do I care about? I can't even think of a hot topic right now, but why do I have to have an opinion on everything? Why? What value does that bring? And moreover, am I making that an educated opinion? To me, that's probably one of the biggest concerns, is that a lot of these opinions are not educated. They're based on reading a headline, reading a snippet, reading something that a biased news source is skewing the story one way or the other, or either excluding facts or presenting things in a certain way so that its base, it reads correctly to its base. And a lot of these opinions that people have right now are so wrong in that they're not educated. They're biased.
I picked up on a couple words you said in there. Said annoying, wrong, not educated. I'm going to ask you a question really quick. When you hear somebody really opinionated, whether it's sitting at family dinner or maybe a coworker you don't particularly enjoy mingling with, what are your initial feelings or emotions when they start spouting their opinion?
Here we go again.
Here we go again. Annoyance, frustration.
Yeah.
Anger.
Well, it depends, right? If it's somebody who I typically agree with, or if their opinion is in line with my opinion, educated or not, I'm gung ho about it. Hey, great! That this guy's a genius.
Yeah.
But obviously, I say that a little tongue in cheek. But the flip side to that is if somebody's in complete disagreement with my general viewpoint, it's here we go again, or this is going to be brutal, or we got to sit through this, or whatever annoyance that you can come up with. But yes, annoyance is the word that you're picking up on.
Yeah, I sense a lot of annoyance in how you're describing this. But that's the thing, is annoyance. How does annoyance serve us? What's annoyance actually doing for us? And obviously that's a very rhetorical question. But if you think about it by that same token, when we're the guy who's got an opinion on everything, when I'm the guy, I've got a lot of opinions. I could talk to you for days about politics, or cough, the vaccine, or sports, or all of these things. But while I have people who might necessarily agree with those viewpoints and those vantage points, there are plenty of people who don't. And I've noticed that I've been presented with opportunities. I remember really early on. So this was 2020. So shortly after COVID got a little crazy, my company had everybody work from home. And at the time, I lived in a smaller house. I was working in my basement. No, excuse me. I didn't even have a basement. I work in my basement currently. I was working in a garage. Working for a tech company in a garage is kind of ridiculous when it's March and really cold. So I let my boss know, and he made some arrangements for me to go back into the office. And I've actually chosen to work in the office most days ever since because I enjoy it. But for a long time in the office, it was myself, the manager for Corp IT, the facilities manager, and like 2 other people. And I had a lot of conversations with the Corp IT guy. Corp IT guy is very opinionated. I'm very opinionated. And the topic of COVID and masks came up. And I told him in no uncertain terms that I thought masks were absolute malarkey and garbage and stupid. And he told me the exact opposite. And do you know what ended up happening? Bet you could guess. Both got pretty heated. Both got really upset. I realized I needed to walk away before we would almost literally come to blows. Now, yes, that's a very extreme example, but look at how I allowed a silly opinion where I knew going into this where he stood. I knew full well where he was on the political spectrum, what his thoughts were about COVID and the masks. I chose to go in there anyways. I was an idiot. I was arrogant. I wasn't thinking correctly. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to show him. I'm going to show him how right I am. And that's kind of the crux for a lot of the opinions or conflicts that we get into is we make the choice to share opinions with people that we know disagree with us. By making that choice, we also know how that's going to end up. All right, cool. We're choosing conflict. How does that serve us? How does that move the needle forward for us? When you step away from a situation where you feel angry, hostile, annoyed, frustrated, what good from a macro level is that actually doing for us?
You and your coworker lost a great opportunity there, right? You lost the opportunity to actually have a conversation. And that's what having these opinions, not necessarily having these opinions, but the smugness or the
grandstanding.
Yeah, that's a great word for it. The grandstanding that we all get with our opinions, right? You and your coworker had very opposing mindsets on this, but that's not a bad thing. We've lost the ability to actually have conversations where we don't agree with each other and try to understand each other's point of view. You don't have to leave those conversations agreeing with the person, but think about the education you could have gotten if you had, I don't know if humility is the right word, but it might be, had a little humility, taken a step back and said, okay, well, I don't agree with your stance and you don't agree with my stance, but let's talk about that and let's figure out why each other thinks these things and understand that we may not agree with each other at the end or even come to some common ground, but we'll both be a little bit more educated on the matter at hand by the end of it.
Yeah.
But instead, you dug your heels in, he dug his heels in, and you butted heads. So that's what we're talking about here is this incessant need to be right. It's not so much having an opinion, because you're invariably going to have an opinion on something. We all have certain social constructs around us that create us as a person. And we will invariably look at a situation and create our own opinion on it, whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether it's based in fact or not, whatever. We create an opinion. It's almost impossible not to have an opinion. You don't need to, but it's very hard not to create an opinion. Where we all fall down, myself included, yourself included, is that we refuse to admit that somebody else's opinion might be right and ours is wrong, or it might be better than ours, or that we're not this brilliant person.
Along those lines, there's nothing, we all have opinions about literally everything. It's not that opinions shouldn't happen. Even on trivial things or things that we have very little passing interest in, we formulated some sort of opinion. The issue that I find most of the time we run into is this incessant need, this, ego-stroking desire to voice those opinions, to share opinion at every opportunity that we get. When sometimes the question we should be asking ourselves is, do I really need to pipe in right now? This opinion that I formed with whatever this is. Case in point, let's look at politics. Okay, we all have opinions politically. Regardless of whether we say that we're political or not, there are things we believe about the president, about the government, about law enforcement, about whatever. We believe politically certain things. We have those opinions inside of ourselves. If you're going into a situation where you work with somebody who's very, very politically charged, somebody who listens to podcasts and watches CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, whatever, all day, and you're going to go in there to spout your opinion, you're looking at entering a situation where you're choosing hostility. So I guess, Dan, the question becomes, when it comes to opinions, how should we know whether we should share them or whether we should keep our damn mouth shut?
At a certain point, we have to have opinions and we have to share them, or else conversation would go nowhere. But at the same time, we have to do it in a manner or we should be doing it in a manner where it's respectful to other people. If we meet and we're just two random people and there's a conflict of sorts that's present and you're on one side of it and I'm on the other, sharing our opinion does nothing to help the situation because we'll probably share it with passion that infuriates the other person. Whereas if we can sit down and try to understand the other person's point of view, there's a difference between understanding their point of view and just spouting your opinion, right? So if I can ask you sincere questions about why you think the way you do, without me getting upset and without them sounding like leading questions to prove you wrong, then we can talk about our opinions in an adult way that may provide a fruitful outcome. Otherwise, we're just shouting facts at each other that may or may not be true and probably making the situation worse, not better.
So that's kind of the kicker, right? Anytime we have these opinions, how often are these opinions based in fact? How often are these opinions actually accurate? You know, this brings me back to the old quote that apparently was attributed to Abraham Lincoln. It said, "It's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than speak out and remove all doubt." How true is that, though? How often is it that you don't know something, you've got a really strong opinion about it, you're just going to shoot your mouth, you're just going to go out there, run your mouth, and then you find out you're wrong? That's happened to me. I've had opinions
more times than I'd like to count. Yeah.
And somebody will stop me and be like, "What are you talking about? That's not accurate at all." And then, often instead of saying, "Oh, no, okay, you're right," what do? You double down. And when you double down, then you really look the fool. And aside from, looking to not cause conflict, this is all about when you're looking out for number one, right? You want to be somebody. We all have, yes, we've talked about this concept of ego, how ego is can be a very dangerous thing. But we all have ego inside ourselves. We all have a certain view of how we view ourselves, our level of intelligence, things we've accomplished, all of that stuff. We care what other people think about us, regardless of what anybody says. Anybody who says that they don't care what others say about them is just a motherfucker. So why be that guy? Why look like an absolute fool or an absolute jackass? And I'll tell you what, I've looked like an absolute jackass more times than I care to admit. I can't tell you how many arguments I've gotten in with my wife where I've had some opinion about something, and she'll look at me dumbfounded like I'm a moron and then show me that I'm wrong. And then what I do, I look around and I'm like, "Oh, okay, you're right." It's on some level, and this is one thing I will say, on some level it feels good to have an opinion on things. On some level it feels good to hear your own voice. On some level it feels good to think that you're winning an argument. But if you think about the concept of stoicism, if you think about men that you respect, how often are they the ones that, while they may have an opinion on something, they're okay keeping their mouth shut? They are comfortable enough with who they are. They have enough self-worth. They have enough, what's the word I'm looking for? But they believe in themselves enough to know that they don't need to just sit here and randomly spout words.
Confidence.
Yeah, that's exactly the word I was looking for. Confidence. And I will tell you something very powerful. I'm somebody who historically has struggled in wanting to fill dead air with words. If there's dead air, I get awkward, I start talking. I have an opinion to share, I've got some story to tell, some anecdote, some quip. I have to say something. Some random musing, some observation, whatever. When my wife and I were going through marriage counseling, the marriage counselor challenged me to allow that dead air to percolate, to not talk, to not fill that dead air with words.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized in that moment, it was then, for the first time in my life, when I realized, you know what? Having an opinion on all this stuff doesn't matter. My opinion in this moment doesn't need to be spoken. My thoughts regarding this don't need to be shared with this audience. I'll tell you what, man, I'm not perfect at it. Hell no. But it felt liberating. It felt that I understood myself, and there was a confidence that I had within myself after I practiced and worked on that I'd never previously experienced, because I didn't need to share it. There was no compelling reason for me to open my mouth.
So there's a lot of stuff in there that got me thinking, but what I really thought about the most was opinion is what happens in the absence of fact. And what I mean by that is, if you know something to be true, then it's not your opinion anymore. It is solid and irrefutable fact. And when you talk about the Stoics and how sometimes they'll just not provide their opinion, my guess is that either they're smart enough to realize that they could be wrong, so it's better to not look the fool, in case somebody else is smarter than them and knows what the fact is, or they know the fact, and does it really help the situation to prove that somebody else is the fool? So what do we do with that information? I look at that concept, and there's a lot of self-realization going on just as we have this conversation. But I look at that concept and go, okay, so does spouting off opinion help? Sometimes. Sometimes it drives conversation.
When?
In the absence of fact on either side. Because sometimes there is no fact, right? How do we balance the budget, the federal budget, right? I don't think there's any necessary fact on how to do it.
Question.
Otherwise, we would do it. There's opinion on both sides of the aisle on how to do it, right? Gun control is a big one that's in the news now. Like, what is proper gun control? Each side has their own opinion, but there's no solid defining fact. It's not like a scientifically proven fact that, like gravity. Gravity is a set figure. You use the number of 9.8 meters per second squared when you use gravity in an equation. That is a fact that is universally accepted. But when you talk about, in this whole conversation, politics is a big place where opinion comes into play, right? How do we solve school shootings? How do we do these things? It's all opinion-based conversation. There is no fact. So you have to have the conversations based on opinion. But to your point earlier is, when do you not share your opinion? When there's a good possibility that there's a fact out there to answer that question and you don't have it. Because chances are somebody in the room does. And either you're going to guess and be smart, or you're going to look the fool. It's probably the latter. You're probably not going to guess right. So why share an opinion that has the potential to be wrong?
I'm often drawn to, a lot of the examples that you shared. You think about balancing the federal budget. You think of gun control. You think of trans rights. Like, think of all these very hotly contested, highly debated things that are currently in the lexicon, that are out there, that we're all very opinionated about. These are very charged topics that people are very incredibly passionate about. If you're going in and sharing your opinion with something that passionate, if you're passionate on one end of the spectrum, there's probably a pretty decent shot, unless you're appealing to buddies or individuals that have the same belief system as you do, or very similar beliefs or similar values, that you could be saying that to somebody who's completely on the opposite end of the spectrum, and they are just as passionate in their take as you are. I know that I am very passionate about my Second Amendment rights. I'm very pro 2A. I acknowledge that. But at the same time, I know that I can't just go like gangbusters into having this conversation with other people. Like, I very selectively choose who I have these conversations with, because, to your point, there are environments and situations in which you can discuss your opinions constructively and productively with both people who agree with you and those who disagree. But you have to understand that there's a certain level of passion that comes in with that, so that when you're sharing these opinions based on passion, you run the risk for that going south for you. Like, for me, think of Second Amendment rights, trans rights, religion. I have very strong opinions on all of these things, but I'm not going to share those opinions with everybody. I actually share some of those opinions with very few people, because I know I believe what I believe. My opinions are my opinions. There are certain things that I find to be truths that are subjective truths within some of my beliefs. I'm not going to tell you what they are. They don't necessarily have to do with all of those things. But I also know that I'm simply wasting energy, wasting my breath, and wasting time that could be better spent in other areas of my life constructively by choosing to refrain from engaging, from spouting my opinion, for giving my 2 cents, because I don't want to open that can of worms. And as you know, we've all been there. Oftentimes when you have a very heated, opinionated argument, discussion, and that results in you getting angry, what's the collateral damage? What have you left in your wake? It can throw the rest of your day for a loop. You can be pissed off. And when you're pissed off, how do you take that out on your family? How do you let that affect you in the gym? How do you let that affect your diet? How do you let that affect all the things in your life that you're trying to improve? I'll tell you what, when I get angry, I'm not the kind of man I need to be for my wife. I'm not the kind of dad I need to be for my kids. I'm not the kind of employee I need to be at work. I'm not where I need to be mentally. And the damage that that causes far outweighs any sort of clout that I might have gained from winning some sort of argument or sharing an opinion with somebody that simply didn't really mean a whole lot.
The interesting thing, or an interesting part of what you just said was, the concept of opinion and how we develop them, and how in a certain group of people, you may be spouting opinion to people that agree. And then in a larger group, there's a good chance that you're spouting opinion that somebody disagrees with. To me, that's the biggest problem that we have, is that we tend to live in echo chambers. We are attracted to people who have similar opinions to us. I will bet a lot of our mutual friends all have the same beliefs as you and me.
True.
We feel the same way about Second Amendment. We feel the same way about marriage rights. We feel the same way about politics in general. Whatever the topic is, we tend to agree with each other. So when we spout our opinions, they almost become fact in those situations because we all believe it.
Yep.
It's when we get outside of our echo chambers where the problems begin. Because now all of a sudden it's the real world, and guess what? In the real world, not everyone thinks the way you do. And that's where we have to distinguish opinion from fact, right? Your opinion on the Second Amendment is just that. It's the opinion. It's your opinion. Same with me. My opinion on the Second Amendment is just that. Do I believe it? Absolutely. I 100% believe that my opinion is the correct interpretation of it. Am I willing to have a conversation with somebody about the differences in our opinion, somebody who's on the other side of the argument that I am? Only if they're willing to make it non-emotional. And I know that I can control myself to be non-emotional. Because otherwise, we're just both going to dig our heels in, and it's going to go back to the conversation you had with your coworker about masks. You're going to dig in, and you're just going to be at odds with each other, and you're going to destroy that relationship in general. So, go ahead.
Just like you were saying, I mean, you're talking about there are certain things, certain opinions that you hold true with Second Amendment, for example. You know that there are people on the other side of the spectrum, especially in New York,
oh yeah,
that are absolutely just as passionate and just as opinionated, and they believe that they are right on the other end of the spectrum. I think oftentimes we lose sight of that. Now, I'm not going to sit here and argue whether they're right or wrong, because that doesn't serve anything, but they truly believe the exact same things you do about their argument, their position on the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
And I would venture to say, when we go into these discussions, we don't always necessarily understand that. We tell ourselves that they don't believe the way that we do, or that we're right. Yeah, well, we may feel that way. We're selling them short and their position short, and all that does is cause chaos.
So you talked at the beginning of this about how this was the result of something you heard on Jocko Underground. I've also heard him, I don't know if it was on the Underground or somewhere else, but I've also heard him present the concept of, so what if you're wrong? I think it was more in like a management scenario where, like accepting ideas from subordinates and that kind of thing. But it was the concept of, so what if I'm wrong? And what if he's right? We don't do nearly enough of that. And I'll be the first to admit that I don't do nearly enough of that. You want to start arguing with me about Second Amendment, I'll dig in my heels and I'll stand my ground, and we'll have a knockdown, drag out fight about why my opinion is correct, because I'm a stubborn asshole sometimes. Am I intellectually capable of understanding the other side's perspective? Absolutely. Do I want to hear it? Probably not. And that's what's wrong. That in general is what we as men need to do a better job of, is putting that ego aside, putting that conviction that we have in our opinions aside, and realizing that we're not arguing fact, we are arguing opinion. So let's stop arguing and let's start having a conversation about, why do you believe that? I truly want to understand your point of view. And I hope that you will do the same to me, so that we can walk away from this conversation, if not changed men, more educated men, and understanding each other's point of view a little bit more. Because if we can do that, we can at least remove the, I don't know, is vitriol the right word? But just the negative connotation of disagreement that exists in the world.
Yeah.
By being able to bring yourself to a level where you're willing to at least hear the other person out and honestly, openly try to absorb the knowledge that they're giving you without influence or without agreement, but just trying to understand where you're coming from, why you're coming from, what makes you believe that. And then doing the same. Those conversations are what's going to start to bridge the gap and at least remove the just the negativity that exists between opposing opinions.
And I will tell you, I believe that you're spot on with all of that, but I will add as a caveat, you're not always going to have that. More often than not,
no.
You're not going to have a willing participant on the other end who's willing to do that. You might even be that unwilling participant to do that. When those times come, because they will, you're going to find yourself in a situation where somebody's not going to want to be a good faith actor in a conversation. It's best to keep your mouth shut. Coming back to that Abraham Lincoln quote, it's okay to keep your opinions to yourself. It's okay to not try to win a pissing contest. It's okay to say, you know what? Here's what I believe. I'm going to keep this to myself today.
No, and I agree 100% with you. I think we're talking about the same thing in a slightly different manner. I'm talking about it in terms of, as men, this is what we need to aspire to in our conversations.
Absolutely.
This is what we, as a collective society, whether you're on the left or the right, whether you're, whatever dichotomy we're talking about in terms of conflict, we need to be able to have these conversations where we can respect somebody else's different point of view and intellectually have a conversation to try to at least understand why they believe something the way they do. Yeah. The flip side to that is what you're talking about is 100% correct. If you're going to potentially enter into a conversation with somebody who is not going to be willing to have a conversation like that, then it's probably best to just shut your trap and move on and just give them the old that's an interesting look on the subject and not really engage it much more than that.
You nailed that point. Is we want to be aspirational in creating that sort of environment. If that's the kind of environment that we want to create, it starts with us. It starts with us going into conversations in good faith, just like you said. We're not going to be able to change other people, but if we can set that example, if you will, I'd be surprised what you find on the other side.
It comes down to respect. And to me, that's the biggest piece that's been lost in society right now is that we do not respect that other people may have a differing opinion and what that is. We also don't respect that there's a difference between opinion and fact sometimes. And I don't know that we necessarily want to go into it, but it gets into that whole concept of, well, that's not my truth. Well, I'm sorry, but there's a truth and there's an opinion. Fact is fact. A ball will drop if you let it go because of gravity. That is a fact, unless you're on the moon. But a lot of the topics that we get into discussions about, there's no set singular fact. And we have to be able to present opinions, understand opposing viewpoints, and at a minimum, agree to disagree and walk away content in the conversation. At a maximum, one side maybe has converted the other to their opinion. But a best case scenario is probably understanding each other's side and maybe finding some common middle ground.
You can't ever go into a situation like that thinking you're going to change somebody's opinion.
No.
I mean, it might happen. It's happened.
It may. It's rare.
Happened, but it's how rare is that?
Yeah.
But if you go in with the intent of seeking mutual understanding, meeting each other halfway, you can work toward that. Mm-hmm. And that, it comes out just like you said, and I think you summed that up really well. If you can exit the conversation feeling content, that in and of itself should be what we strive for and aspire to achieve.
I mean, at the end of the day, the worst thing that happens in a situation like that is you learn something, they learn something, and perhaps the next time you have a conversation, you find a little more common ground in the middle.
There you go. You nailed it, man.
All right, dude. Hey, you know what? Another interesting topic to discuss with you. So I really appreciate this conversation. All you fellas, thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. Check us out at untamingmasculinity.com. You can find show notes to this and all of our other episodes there, as well as links to our social media. Because you found value here, please go give us a rating and review on your podcast player. That really helps us spread the word to other men and get the message out. And just remember, it's the rating and the review that really helps us. It's the combination thereof. And finally, make sure you're coming back next week for some more great content. Until then, we'll leave you with just one question. What are you doing to untame your masculinity?